When you create a pivot table, you can rearrange the data to emphasize exactly the elements that you're interested in. In this movie, I will show you how to manage pivot tables. That includes tasks such as renaming a pivot table, selecting the entire pivot table, moving it, and deleting it. As my sample file, I will use the Managing Workbook, which you can find in the Chapter 1 folder of your exercise files archive. It's possible to use pivot tables in formulas, and I show you how to do that elsewhere in the course. And every pivot table has a name. That's one way that you know which pivot table you're referring to when you create a formula based on its data. You can find a pivot table's name by clicking any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Analyze tab, you can look over in the pivot table group at the far left and look in the pivot table name box. And in this case, the name of this pivot table is Pivot Table 3. That's not very informative. I mean, it could be anything. What you can do is edit this value by clicking in the box to select the entire value, and then type in something that describes the data in the pivot table. And in this case, I'll call it Department, DEPT, Quarter, QUARTER, and press Enter. Now the pivot table is named Department Quarter so that I know, at least in my own head, that the row labels are the departments and the column labels are the quarters. Now let's say that I want to select a pivot table. For example, if I want to copy it or perhaps even delete it. To select an entire pivot table, again, click any cell in the body of the pivot table. And again, on the Analyze tab, click the Select button, and then click Entire Pivot Table. Doing so selects the entire pivot table. Now you can copy it or delete it. If you want to copy it, with the entire pivot table selected, just press Ctrl-C to copy, and you can see that it has the marquee outline. Now you can paste the pivot table on another worksheet. Say, for example, if I click the PT Paste Sheet tab here and display that worksheet, I can press Ctrl-V to paste the pivot table, and you can see that my new pivot table appears. And with the pivot table selected, click the Analyze tab, and it's called Pivot Table 1, and again, I could rename it as before. I want to emphasize that this is a second pivot table, so if I were to click back on Sheet 2, the original pivot table is still there, and it is independent of this pivot table on this worksheet. Now let's say that I want to delete this pivot table. With the entire pivot table selected, and again, that procedure is to click any cell within the pivot table, click Select, and click Entire Pivot Table. I can delete it by selecting it as I just showed you and pressing the Delete key. So now the pivot table is gone, and I just have the one pivot table left in this workbook on Sheet 2. Now let's say that I have a pivot table and I want to reset it. In other words, I want to remove all of its fields, any filters, and so on. I just want to go back to a blank worksheet with an empty pivot table. To do that, click any cell in the body of the pivot table, and on the Analyze tab, click Clear, and click Clear All. Doing so resets the pivot table, and if I click here, refrains from doing so. Doing so resets the pivot table, and if I want to bring it back and recreate it, I just click here on the graphic indicating where the pivot table will go. That brings back my pivot table fields pane, and I can add any fields that I want back to it. So for example, I can put department in the rows area, quarter in the columns area, and sales in the values area. So those are the basics of managing a pivot table, showing you how to rename it, how to select it, how to move it, and also, if you want to, how to delete it. All those skills are very useful, and you'll probably use them more than you think when you're working with pivot tables in Excel 2013.